a national identity that was built on the shared pursuit of excellence has since perverted into this new national identity that's taken the form of this victimhood grievance Olympics, where there is no gold medalist. It is our nation and our national identity that loses in the end. And that's the heart of this whole new book. That's why I wrote the book, is someone who needed to expose this in some ways as a first generation American, looking at this not as somebody who inherited America, but whose parents came to this country voluntarily with their 2 feet to be part of that national identity. And yet now, 40 years later, found a new national identity centered on this black hole of victimhood instead.
You mentioned the fiduciary responsibility that these boards have to their shareholders. Are you surprised, or was there an example of a company where the shareholders were able to fight this effectively? I mean, I remember literally on my show 5 or 6 years ago when Google AdSense was clamping down on everybody, I had a couple of guests in a row and I was calling for it too. It's like, where are the shareholders who are going, well, wait a minute, put censorship aside for a second. If they are not putting ads on certain things, am I being hurt as a shareholder? Are there any examples where the shareholders actually accomplished anything, or lawsuits or anything?
Not a ton yet. That's what I'm working on, man.
All right.
I started Strive. So Strive is a new firm competing with Blackrock. We just sent a public letter to Chevron calling out a lot of these behaviors that, crucially though, were forced on them by Blackrock, State Street, and Vanguard. In many cases, Chevron actually said initially that they opposed these proposals, but then the large shareholders vote for them anyway. And this is the problem, Drew, is that a lot of the movement, that you would advocate for shareholder-centric power, what they miss is that the 21st century version of this problem is different. They've thrown a tripwire that a lot of us fell for, which was that they said, okay, Milton Friedman, you said that shareholders rule, right? And company management teams report to shareholders. Well, guess what? We are the shareholder. And we're demanding that you, the company management, adopt these social agendas. You're not betraying your fiduciary duty to us. You're actually working for us, because we, the shareholder, Milton Friedman all along said it, rule, and you owe the duty to us, and we, the shareholder, are demanding it. So here's the fallacy in that argument. But that's effectively what allowed this problem to spread like wildfire, is the parlance of fiduciary duty to shareholder misses the fact that the shareholder, I use shareholder in air quotes, is actually the one pushing the agenda. So to do this, we have to get a little academic for a second. Let's roll.
I got a bright audience.
We'll be
all right.
I'll stop. Okay. But okay. So the whole shareholder primacy doctrine came from, it was a vestige of 20th century corporate law, and even Friedman, I thinking in the late 20th century, that solved a problem called the separation of ownership and control. Okay. So the CEO has control of the firm, but the shareholder owns the firm. They're not the same person. That gives rise to what's called a principal-agent conflict. The shareholder is the principal, the CEO is the agent, leads to the private jet problem of, CEOs that are flying on private jets, using the shareholder capital to do it, the RJR Nabisco problem, overspending. Well, how do you close that gap? It's by imposing a fiduciary duty on the CEO to the shareholder. So Milton Friedman would say the CEO can't pursue these social agendas without serving the interest of the shareholder. That's where the fiduciary duty came from. So that's 20th century stuff. It's called the separation of ownership and control. The 21st century version of this problem is different. It is not the separation of ownership and control. It is the separation of ownership and ownership. And what I mean by that is the parties who now then claim to be the owners, the shareholders of these companies, like Blackrock, State Street, and Vanguard, they are not the actual owners of those companies, because they launched these so-called passive index funds that aggregated trillions of dollars in the last 15 years that are the money of everyday citizens who are the actual owners of the company, but invested in vehicles that were managed by a managerial clique that then showed up in the boardrooms of those companies and said, you know what, I am the shareholder and I'm demanding you behave this way. But
so basically, in essence, though, the average shareholder probably didn't even know what was going on.
They didn't know what's going on. They didn't know what's going on. So the way I talk about this is no longer as shareholders, but as the owners of the company, the actual end owner of capital, the everyday citizen whose money is being invested through a microchips mediated financial system that then goes into a pension fund, that then asks an investment consultant where to invest, that then invests in a fund managed by Blackrock, that then invests in a company. It's such an intermediated system that the actual owner of capital has no idea that that state pension fund and its board member and its investment staff and BlackRock were betraying their interests by representing viewpoints in corporate America's boardrooms, in the boardrooms of companies like Chevron, the one I wrote to earlier this week, in ways that the owner of capital had no idea was actually happening. So that's really how this plays out in reality, where the parties who claim to be the shareholders are not the actual shareholders. And that's the big problem.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's shift a little bit to the sort of spiritual part of this, or the generational, the cultural part that you're talking about. You mentioned before, from Indian background, you grew up in the Midwest. I mean, I suspect that whether it was your parents or great-grandparents or whatever it might be that came from India, I'm guessing they didn't come with a lot, and they probably had to work real hard.
Nope,
and I'm guessing that they don't feel very guilty about your success.
No, they don't. And that's the thing. Whether they're Republican, Democrat, the thing you find about immigrants who come to this country through the front door, and I distinguish that, for coming through the back, but legal immigrants to the front door, by and large, come to this country to pursue excellence, to pursue their dreams, to pursue excellence without having to apologize for it. Leaving places that were anti-meritocratic to come to a meritocratic nation where, regardless of your creed or skin color, you can achieve anything you want with your own hard work and commitment and dedication. That used to be our national identity. We now have a new national identity built on victimhood instead. And one of the things, my parents taught me from a young age is that hardship is not the same thing as you're going to encounter hardship in your life. It's part of what teaches you who you are. But we live now in a moment where kids are taught, the next generation, by the way, I was first generation. My parents were the immigrants. I was born in America. The second and third generation, even in the Asian American communities, are being taught this new narrative to say that, you know what? The more you think of yourself as a victim, as a person of color, or whatever your victimhood narrative is, that's how you get ahead in life, not by actually unapologetically embracing the pursuit of excellence. And that's become our new national identity. A national identity that was built on the shared pursuit of excellence has since perverted into this new national identity that's taken the form of this victimhood grievance Olympics, where there is no gold medalist. It is our nation and our national identity that loses in the end. And that's the heart of this whole new book. That's why I wrote the book, is someone who needed to expose this in some ways as a first generation American, looking at this not as somebody who inherited America, but whose parents came to this country voluntarily with their 2 feet to be part of that national identity. And yet now, 40 years later, found a new national identity centered on this black hole of victimhood instead.
Did the neo-libs or the libs or the neo-progressives or whatever version, whatever language you want to use around that, is there some reason that they inherently failed with this? That they didn't defend the ideas that their ancestors came here for well enough?
Yeah, so I think some of it was this generational insecurity. I think it's this idea that when you haven't encountered hardship, actually, you begin to hunger for it. There's something about the human psyche that's a funny thing. We require hardship and the experience of overcoming it to remind ourselves the contours of our soul, of who we are. I gave the high school commencement address to my own high school where I graduated. I gave a commencement address when I graduated, in 2003. They invited me back to give an updated address last year at last year's commencement. And it struck me that was the first graduating class that had in-person graduation where not a single member of that class was even born on the day that those twin towers were hit by those two planes. And that defined part of my high school experience. I was in high school, I was AP history class or US history class at that particular time. It was, it was a defining moment. You're looking at a generation where not a single person had been through that experience. And I'm not saying that it had to be 9/11, but I think a generation that actually is on the receiving end of that intergenerational wealth transfer, that hasn't had to necessarily, either as a citizen or as an individual, fight for the kind of right to be able to be proud, needs to then see themselves as the victim of some other hardship instead. And so you could argue maybe it's not even their fault. This is just what the arc of history has dealt our generation, millennials, Gen Z, and younger, to have to think of themselves as encountering hardships that don't even actually exist, and then reinvent that victimhood narrative until a new one is dealt in its place instead. But the problem is, if you live in that victimhood narrative for long enough, you're not even going to have the fortitude to fight that hardship when it actually comes. Maybe that's China. Maybe it's something else. Whatever it is, if we don't turn this culture around, I think we will have actually lost the very fortitude that we might have gotten from actually encountering more. Part of the diagnosis for me.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about politics instead of nonstop yelling, check out our politics playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.